Should more people support rescue channels like this? The wind cut through the thin fabric of my jacket, whipping around me as if the forest itself were angry. I stumbled over the uneven ground, heart hammering, the bitter scent of wet pine and decay clinging to the air. That's when I saw it, tiny, trembling, and helpless, tied to a gnarled tree with frayed rope that bit into its soft fur. Its eyes were wide and dark, shining with a mixture of fear, confusion, and a quiet plea that pierced straight through me. A scrap of paper fluttered in the wind, pinned to the tree by the same cruel knot that bound the little body. I reached for it, hands shaking, and the words etched in jagged handwriting burned through me before I even fully read them. My chest constricted, throat tight, and I had to kneel to keep from collapsing. How could someone do this? How could anyone leave a life so small, so pure, dangling between the mercy of strangers and the cruelty of the world? The rain began to fall, cold and stinging, and I felt the raw, unfiltered weight of helplessness pressing down on me. And yet, in that trembling, sodden moment, I knew, if I didn't act, if I didn't fight, nothing would. The forest was quiet in a way that made your chest ache, the kind of silence that presses down on your thoughts and amplifies the smallest noises. Rain had begun to fall again, a fine icy drizzle that clung to the tips of leaves and pooled in the ruts of the muddy path. My boots sank into the wet earth with each step, sucking at the soles as though the ground itself wanted to keep me from moving forward. I had come out here on a whim, a late afternoon hike to shake the weight of a week that had already bruised me in ways I couldn't name. But the moment I rounded a bend, something broke through the monotony. A sound, tiny and fragile, that didn't belong to the wind. At first, I thought it was a trick of the rain, a branch knocking against another. But then I heard it again, a small, panicked whine that twisted my gut tighter than I could remember. My eyes darted across the sodden forest floor, searching through shadows that pooled beneath towering pines, until I saw a small figure, shivering violently, tied to a tree. The rope was frayed and cruel, biting into soft, matted fur, and a scrap of paper was pinned above the creature, flapping like a wounded flag. My heart lodged somewhere between my throat and stomach as I sprinted forward, boots slipping in mud, hands reaching out instinctively. The puppy, a German shepherd, barely more than a month old, looked up at me with eyes that held an entire lifetime of terror in a single glance. Its body trembled not just from cold but from the weight of abandonment, a small chest rising and falling with ragged breaths. I could see the raw patches of fur rubbed away where the rope had gnawed too deeply, tiny paws struggling against the mud beneath them. It was impossible to ignore the quiet dignity in the puppy's fear, the way it refused to collapse entirely, even as the storm and the world itself seemed determined to crush it. I bent down, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the knot. The note fluttered violently in the wind, and I grabbed it, heart hammering, desperate to know why someone could be so cruel. The words were jagged, almost childlike. I can't keep it. It won't survive with me. Do what you must. My chest constricted, and I had to swallow the lump that had formed in my throat. It was not just the cruelty of abandonment that struck me, but the mixture of guilt and helplessness the note carried, a silent acknowledgement of giving up, of surrendering a life too young to fight for itself. Rain mixed with tears I hadn't realized were falling, soaking the edges of the paper and running down my face. The puppy whimpered again as I crouched beside it, and I reached out, my fingers brushing against the damp fur. It flinched violently, ears flattening, but didn't pull away. Something flickered in its dark eyes, a fragile thread of trust, tentative and trembling, like a candle struggling against the wind. I worked on the knot with careful hands, the rope cutting slightly into my palms as I tugged, each second stretching like an eternity. The wind caught the note again, and for a brief instant, I thought it might blow away, taking the silent confession with it. I tucked it into my jacket, a private witness to this small tragedy. Finally freed. The puppy collapsed against me, small paws splayed on my knees, shivering violently. Its body was a living tremor, but it wasn't just fear anymore. It was exhaustion, disbelief, and a flicker of hope. I wrapped it in my jacket, feeling the wet weight of its fur and the delicate rise and fall of its chest. The rain had intensified, drumming against leaves, against my shoulders, against the fragile shelter we had formed together. The forest around us was indifferent, its shadows and whispers pressing in. But for a moment, the world narrowed to the two of us, a trembling life cradled in human arms, and a human suddenly tasked with something much bigger than themselves. As I lifted the puppy and started moving toward the path that would lead out of the forest, I felt the weight of silence shift. It was no longer just the oppressive quiet of the woods. It had become a tangible thing, heavy with responsibility, with a kind of moral reckoning I wasn't ready for. The puppy nestled against my chest, wet fur clinging to me, and I realized that this moment, this small life depending entirely on my hands and choices, would change everything. The storm around us roared indifferent, but inside me, a pulse of determination began, fragile but unwavering. If I didn't act, if I didn't fight, nothing would, and I couldn't live with that. The forest began to blur behind me as I carried the tiny German shepherd puppy through the muddy path, its small body quivering violently against my chest. Every step sank me deeper into wet earth. But I didn't notice. The world had narrowed to the soft weight in my arms and the rhythmic thrum of a heart that was almost too fragile to trust. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, leaving beads of water clinging to pine needles and dripping from my hair, mixing with the damp heat of the puppy pressed against me. I whispered nonsense, half to distract it, half to distract myself, words that sounded like they could stitch comfort into the jagged edges of fear, though I had no right to promise anything. It was only when I set it down on a small patch of dry ground, shivering violently, that I realized the true scale of its trauma. The puppy flinched at the smallest movement, ears flattened, tail tucked, and I had to remind myself to breathe. I crouched, keeping my eyes level with its own, letting it see that I was steady, that I wasn't going to vanish or strike. Slowly, tremor by tremor, the German shepherd sniffed my outstretched hand, small, wet nose brushing against my fingers. It pulled back almost immediately, but the brief connection was enough to ignite the smallest thread of trust, fragile but real. I gathered some fallen leaves and tried to make a little shelter, pressing damp pine branches around the edges to block the wind. It wasn't much, but the puppy crawled into it hesitantly, curling itself into a tight, trembling ball. I stayed close, knees pressed into the mud, murmuring soft words I didn't even know I believed in. Each glance I stole at it revealed the subtle dance of fear and curiosity, the tiny, urgent need to survive warred against instinctive distrust. The puppy would nuzzle at the edge of my jacket, then recoil, ears flattening in warning. Every small gesture felt monumental, every moment of eye contact a victory in a war I hadn't realized I'd enlisted myself in. I found a stick and tried to offer it as a toy, tapping it lightly on the wet ground. The puppy flinched, watching me with wide, wary eyes. But curiosity crept in slowly, a tremor running through its body as it pawed at the stick, careful, testing the world and me at the same time. My chest loosened a fraction, and I allowed myself a small, shaky smile. Here was progress, tiny and fragile, but progress nonetheless. I reached out again, letting it sniff my hand, then gently lifted it into my lap. Its small body pressed against mine, soaking my jacket with wet fur, but I didn't care. It shivered violently, and I held it closer, murmuring words that were more prayer than conversation. Night fell faster than I expected, the sky darkening to a bruised purple, and the forest transformed into a labyrinth of shadows and dripping branches. I wrapped the puppy in the driest part of my jacket I could find, creating a cocoon against the cold, while the drizzle became a soft patter that mingled with the rustle of leaves. The first meal I offered, a small handful of whatever scraps I had, was approached with hesitation. The puppy sniffed, stepped back, then returned, pawing carefully at the food as though each bite was a question of trust. When it finally ate, a small, trembling tail flicked against my arm, and I felt a tiny surge of triumph, mingled with relief and a sharp, aching awareness of how close we had come to nothingness. We stayed like that for hours, huddled in a fragile bubble against the dark and cold, the rain tapping a slow, uneven rhythm on the branches above. I watched the puppy sleep for the first time without flinching, chest rising and falling in shallow waves, and I felt a connection that was quiet but absolute. I realized that this fragile creature, abandoned and trembling, had begun to open a space in me for something I hadn't admitted I needed: hope. Every small wag of its tail, every tentative nuzzle, every inch of trust gained was a thread weaving me into a story I didn't know I was part of, a story about saving and being saved in return. By the time I finally forced myself to stand, carefully tucking the puppy closer into the folds of my jacket, I understood something profound: trust could not be demanded, it could only be offered. And the fragile bond forming between us was more than survival. It was the beginning of something neither of us had dared to hope for. Outside, The forest whispered around us, indifferent and unyielding, but within that small cocoon of warmth and quiet breath, fear had loosened its grip, just a little, and for the first time since finding it tied to that tree, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, we could both survive this storm. The forest grew darker with each step, the remaining light fading to a bruised gray that pooled in the gaps between trees. The drizzle had returned, heavier now, and each drop splashed cold against my cheeks and the puppy's damp fur. It had nestled against my chest all morning, but as the path narrowed and the shadows deepened, its trembling returned, subtle at first, then urgent, a quiet panic that cut through my own tired thoughts. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig underfoot, made its small body stiffen, ears flattening as though the world outside our fragile bubble had turned predator overnight. I adjusted the puppy in my arms, murmuring soft reassurances I wasn't sure it understood, though the rhythm of my voice seemed to calm it slightly. Its paws pressed lightly against my jacket, gripping like it was holding on for dear life, and I realized in that moment just how fragile this connection still was. The rope burns along its legs had begun to scab, but the memory of pain lingered, written in every hesitant step, every flinch. I kept my movements slow, deliberate, hoping that each careful gesture would speak louder than words, that my presence alone could carve a small pocket of safety in a world that had proven itself merciless. The path became almost impassable as the rain intensified, pooling into muddy streams and washing away any familiar scent trails. My boots sank deeper into the muck, pulling at my legs, and I felt the strain in my shoulders as I carried the puppy, heavier now not just from weight but from the silent, shared anxiety between us. The puppy whined softly, a high, fragile sound that echoed among the trees, and I pressed a hand to its back, murmuring, "It's okay, I'm here. I won't let anything happen." The words sounded almost absurd against the indifferent roar of the forest, but they grounded us both in the present, a tether to something resembling hope. We stumbled upon a small clearing, partially sheltered by a fallen tree that had created a hollow beneath its roots. I crouched and placed the puppy gently inside, pressing dry leaves around the edges to block the worst of the wind. The puppy flinched at each gust, ears flicking backward, eyes wide, but it didn't try to run. I stayed low, moving slowly, letting it sniff my hands and face, whispering encouragements that were half comfort, half apology for the world that had failed it. The air smelled of wet earth and pine, sharp and biting, a reminder that safety here was temporary, fragile, but the best we could hope for until daylight. Night was falling, and with it, the forest transformed into a shadowed maze of shapes and sounds, each one amplified by my own fatigue and the puppy's anxiety. I gathered small branches, stacking them carefully to create a windbreak, and then offered a few crumbs of food. The puppy approached cautiously, sniffing, pausing, retreating, then returning again. Each tentative step, each soft nudge of its nose against my hand, felt monumental, like the first fragile leaf of spring daring to grow through frost. When it finally ate, my shoulders relaxed just slightly, and I realized how much I had been holding my breath, waiting for a signal that it might survive. We huddled together beneath the fallen tree, the rain drumming against leaves above us, and for a few moments the world fell away. I watched the puppy's small chest rise and fall, eyelids drooping, ears flicking at every sound but gradually loosening with exhaustion. I traced a finger along its damp fur, feeling the tiny tremors fade into tentative trust. The forest was still dangerous, still indifferent, but here in this hollow, I had carved a sliver of sanctuary. It was fragile, temporary, but it was ours. I thought of the rope burns, the note, the indifference that had left this life dangling in the wind, and I felt a surge of something fierce, resolve. I would carry this fragile trust forward, through mud, through shadow, through every gust of wind and drop of rain. The puppy shifted in my arms, pressing closer, and I felt the first real warmth of reciprocated trust, a fragile bond that pulsed between us, delicate as a thread but stronger than fear. Outside, the forest whispered, shadows shifting and growing, but within our small pocket, a fragile light had taken hold. Sleep came slowly, both for the puppy and for me. The drizzle continued, each drop a reminder of the storm we had survived and the one still ahead. I held it close, whispering words into the dark, promising safety in a world that had given none. Shadows surrounded us, threatening, unpredictable, but beneath the fallen tree, in the quiet of shared breath and warmth, we had created something impermanent, something fragile, something worth fighting for. And for the first time since that rope had cut into its legs, I believed that we could face whatever came next together. Morning came slowly, hesitating behind the thick veil of clouds and mist. The forest was wet and heavy, the rain from last night still dripping from every branch and pooling in the folds of the earth. I stirred first, shifting carefully so as not to wake the puppy, but it was already stirring beside me, small body tense yet moving with a fragile curiosity. The night had been long, filled with whispered reassurances and the soft rhythm of its trembling chest against mine. But now the forest seemed softer somehow, muted in pale gray light that filtered through the mist. For the first time, the world didn't feel quite so indifferent. The puppy lifted its small head, ears flicking at every sound, the distant splash of water, the flutter of wings, the rustle of leaves. But it didn't bolt. It sniffed the air hesitant, then nudged its tiny nose against my hand. A warmth bloomed in my chest at the sight, a fragile joy that seemed almost absurd after the terror of yesterday. But it was there nonetheless. I reached down, letting it climb onto my lap, its damp fur clinging to me, and for the first time it didn't flinch. Its trust, tentative and trembling, had begun to root itself. I offered breakfast, a small collection of crumbs and scraps, and watched as it approached cautiously, tail flicking nervously. Each bite was slow, careful, almost reverent, as if the puppy were testing the world and me at the same time. When it finally ate, I let out a quiet sigh, the tension in my shoulders easing, replaced with something new: hope. The morning was fragile, the clouds still heavy, but the first small light of a life recovering had begun to filter through, soft and insistent. We spent the morning exploring the clearing cautiously. The puppy's small paws pressed into the wet earth, sinking slightly, but it moved with more confidence than before. Its ears twitched at distant sounds, but it no longer flinched at shadows. Every so often it would look back at me, eyes bright, seeking confirmation that I was still there. And I was, steadfast, careful, endlessly patient. Every tentative step forward, every sniff of new territory, was a milestone, and I felt an unexpected swell of pride mixed with relief. Survival, it seemed, was a series of tiny victories strung together, each one more precious than the last. By midday, the rain had stopped entirely, leaving the forest dripping and fragrant with wet pine and earth. Shafts of sunlight pierced through breaks in the clouds, illuminating the puppy's fur, turning each strand into gold. It ran a few steps ahead of me, then stopped, looked back, and barked softly, a sound so full of wonder and tentative joy that my heart ached. I laughed quietly, a sound I hadn't realized I'd missed, and it barked again, bounding closer, shaking water from its damp coat. For the first time since finding it tied to that tree, I felt a profound sense of connection. We weren't just surviving, we were beginning to live. I found a small, sheltered hollow beneath a cluster of trees and set down a makeshift bed of leaves and dry pine needles. The puppy curled into it immediately, ears flicking as it stretched luxuriously, tail wagging softly. I watched, fascinated and quietly moved as it discovered its own strength in these small acts. The courage to explore, the confidence to eat, the willingness to rest without fear. Each gesture was a testament to resilience, a reminder that even the most fragile lives could grow stronger in the right hands. As the afternoon sun filtered through the thinning clouds, I began to notice more subtle changes. The puppy's eyes no longer darted constantly with panic. Its breaths were steadier, less ragged. The tremor in its paws had softened. It playfully batted at a fallen leaf, then scampered back to my side, seeking comfort but already learning to trust the world a little more. And in that play, in that small, ordinary act, I saw the first real evidence of healing, not just of its body, but of its spirit. Evening approached with a quiet, lingering peace. The forest had lost its oppressive weight, replaced by the gentle sounds of life, distant birds calling, leaves dripping their last droplets, wind rustling softly through the trees. The puppy lay curled against my chest, eyelids drooping, breathing slow and steady. I traced a finger along its damp fur, marveling at how far we had come in so little time. The note that had once haunted me, the rope that had cut into tender flesh, the trembling and terror, all of it felt momentarily distant, softened by the fragile warmth of recovery and trust. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine the days ahead, not endless survival but thriving, growing, and learning to live without fear. The puppy's presence had rewritten the narrative of that stormy night, and in its small, trusting gaze, I found a reflection of my own fragile hope. We had survived the shadows together and the dawn had finally broken, fragile and golden, across both our lives. In that quiet, dripping forest, The smallest heartbeat against my chest reminded me that life, no matter how battered, could begin again.